President Biden is pouring rhetorical gasoline on smoldering fires all over the globe right now, which could, if not handled properly or ramped back, blow up in our faces and cause us to get sucked into not one, but probably multiple wars around the world. Now, if you think that's an exaggeration, we've got some things to show you here, which should alarm everybody. And as we're going to point out here, there are some potential consequences and some that are already occurring, which harm our national security in ways that you may not be aware of, but that you need to be aware of and that we all need to see change. Now, we have nobody better to talk about those crucial issues than Colonel Douglas Macgregor, former highly decorated combat veteran, was also the advisor to the Secretary of Defense under the Trump administration, the current CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, which I advise everyone to go check out if you haven't somehow already, if somehow you've missed it, because that is the one bright spot that we can point to of hope for this country. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Thanks.
So let's just jump right into it because, people may have some idea of one or two of the things I'm talking about, but I'm not sure everybody's aware of the comprehensive trouble that we're trying to get ourselves into. We're going to start off in Europe with the Russia-Ukraine war. And as you're about to see, this is not just the United States that's lost some of its mind on some things, but it is the U.S.'s leadership, which we always want to talk about, which has taken us in a bad direction, or the absence of leadership, which is allowing others to go in bad directions, either of which are bad for us. But before we start on any of that, Doug, I want to play a short clip of something you said to Tucker Carlson last year, which is starting to really look scarily premonition about things that are happening right now. Play that role.
Because from the very beginning, Putin and his advisors were never interested in a war with NATO or the United States. That's why you've had such incrementalism, this slow grind of movement forward, defensive operations for a long period to build up the force, and then continued offensive operations. They have over 300,000 combat troops in reserve in Russia. And I think they're sitting there and not being released to fight because President Putin anticipates the possibility that we will intervene in Western Ukraine. And if we intervene in Western Ukraine, the Russians will be ready for that. And the consequences for us and for NATO will be devastating because we are not ready to fight the Russians.
Now, Biden doesn't seem to be tracking that we're not ready, or else he's unaware that that's a risk. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, he was saying why we need to pass this supplemental funding for the Ukraine side because, well, I'll let him tell it.
The idea that we're going to walk away from Ukraine, the idea that we're going to let NATO begin to split is totally against the interests of the United States of America, and it is against our word we've given since all the way back to Eisenhower. So it's about time we make sure that Congress come home and pass the legislation funding NATO. It's critical.
Okay, before we get into the next one here of something that Macron has been saying, I want to stop and talk on that for a second because I'm not sure what the president's talking about, promises that we've made with troops going back to Eisenhower, which has anything at all to do with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Do you have any idea where he's going with all that?
I think he's confused, which is not new for President Biden. The people in Washington have a very strange view of history. It's worth pointing out that when Eisenhower was president, he thought that all of the countries in the Baltic states, Poland, this thing that used to be called Czechoslovakia, and other states in the region should be neutralized. So Eisenhower made no promises about doing anything regarding Eastern Europe. There is nothing in the NATO treaty that obligates us to do anything in Ukraine, nor should there be. If he has an obligation, it's a moral obligation, and that is to end the war in Ukraine. He doesn't seem to understand that the war is lost. It's been lost for months. The Russians are plugging away. They're moving closer and closer to the river. And ultimately, they'll make the decision to cross, I suspect, and deal with Odessa. And if they need to, move right into Kiev. The notion that we should stop any of it is absurd. We could have stopped this, as we know, back at the end of March, beginning of April, with a settlement that we could have helped sponsor and put an end to this disaster. We've done everything to keep it going and make it worse.
We indeed we have. And now that it looks like Macron is in fact going to try and make it worse. So first, let's talk about what he said, and then let's talk about some of the reasonings behind it. Play this clip.
Is it or is it not our war? Can we look away and let things unravel? I don't think so. I call for a strategic surge and I stand by it fully. We need to be realistic about the situation that's unfolding in Europe, the risks that exist, and what we need to stand for.
Now, I guess, let's see, I think it was possibly yesterday, this past weekend, the Polish foreign minister threw a little more fuel on the fire of his own.
Żołnierze krajów NATO już są na Ukrainie i chciałbym serdecznie podziękować ambasadorom tych krajów, które takie ryzyko podjęły. One same wiedzą najlepiej, które to są.
Bo pan nie powie przecież.
Bo ja w odróżnieniu od niektórych polityków europejskich tego nie będę mówił.
That silly smirk on his face of like, yeah, we've got NATO soldiers, and I'm not going to say who they are in Ukraine. And of course, we know the issue with the German chancellor not long ago admitting that UK and French soldiers had been actually out there operating. But that's a separate issue. Then you have Zelensky, of course, who's trying to say, yeah, y'all are all right. Y'all need to come on my side when he says this.
All leaders in international organizations must respond to Russia's actions. And the response must be tough. Putin does not want any peace. He only wants war and death. He does not care whom he kills. The main goal is to destroy. First Ukraine and Ukrainians. And then you, dear partners. That is why it is a matter of survival, and not only for Ukraine, that the world reacts to Russian evil and exerts pressure and hits back.
So you keep seeing President Biden say routinely when he talks about this in public that, hey, Ukraine's not asking for our men. We're not going to send our men. They just want the help. But now you're seeing that he's laying the foundation of saying, you guys got to come help us, because if not, we're all going to die. He's going to come after all of us. And Doug, I get it why he says that. I mean, his country has been invaded. He wants help from anywhere else can get it. He'll say whatever to get them. I get that. But not Macron, not some of these other countries who have nothing to gain by a war with Russia and everything to lose. So what is their play here?
Zelensky is the architect of war, death, and destruction for Ukraine. And as I've said before, he's not Ukrainian. He's from the East. He grew up as a Russian speaker. He's thoroughly Russified, has no use for Ukraine. He was picked up as a puppet by, the oligarch, Kolomoisky, and established in power with the blessing and support of people like Nuland. So that's the first point. Secondly, all of the globalist elites in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe are in trouble. They're in a position that is untenable. Macron is very weak. Scholz is weak, which is why Scholz is running away from Macron and his dumb ideas as fast as he can go. The globalist elites that are ruling Western Europe, and frankly that are governing us here, are in a very dangerous position. They are probably going to be removed in the near future. This is their last-ditch attempt to stay in power. How do you stay in power when you're losing? Well, you pretend that there's a great enemy out there that threatens everyone. You try to convince everyone that you are their savior, and that's what Macron and his contemporaries are trying to do. It's not working. The leadership of the French army has scoffed at the idea of sending anybody to Ukraine. They know that the French military is in no position to go there and do anything. The same thing is true for the rest of the European militaries. Anybody who suggests otherwise is crazy. We are in no position to attack into Ukraine. Our position is fragile. We're not ready for a war of any magnitude against any major power on the planet. So it's all nonsense. It's empty rhetoric. It's designed to create an illusion they hope will keep them in power. It's not going to work.
Now, we're going to talk specifically about that issue about the United States Armed Forces, and that's a part of this I want to illuminate that people may not be aware of, just how much trouble we're in internally on that. And I know that's an issue close to near and dear to your heart. But let's look on back to the Macron stuff a second ago, because if that's a gamble that he's not going to have to act on that kind of thing, because there was a Substack out, I believe it was this morning, where it's talking about that he's saying, and others are saying, that not just if Russia comes into NATO, there could be a problem, but if Russia moves on Odessa, that could be a red line that could cause actions. Now, I think that you said something about that's a possibility a second ago. If Russia starts moving in that direction because Ukraine doesn't have a negotiated settlement, then Macron is going to be in a position to either be exposed as being tepid and not meaning what he said, or acting and sending French troops into Ukraine, which would be absurd. So where is that going?
The only thing worse than provoking an unnecessary war is to try and bluff your way through one. And that's what everybody in the West is busy doing. We've run out of ammunition, out of equipment. We don't have enough trained troops. There's no stomach for it. The populations in Europe are beginning to slowly but surely wake up to reality that Russia poses no threat to them. So again, this is all an illusion. Now, as far as Odessa is concerned, it was made pretty clear from the outset of this crisis and conflict that the Russians would move on those areas that historically were Russian and contained Russian speakers. Odessa was never part of Ukraine, just as Crimea was never a part of Ukraine. And the eastern portions in the Donetsk Basin were always Russian speakers and Russian people. All of this is nonsense. The Russian leadership has said when this is over, Kharkov, which is another historic Russian city, along with Odessa, will be Russian again. There's nothing new in that. If we try to move against the Russians and cross the border, either from Moldova or Romania or Poland, in an effort to stop the Russian seizure of Odessa, we will be at war with Russia, because the Russians have also made it very clear they won't tolerate it. They will not tolerate a NATO presence in Western Ukraine. We're back to the original requirement.
Well, yeah, because that's what started the war in the first place, is the NATO in Ukraine.
Exactly. So if they go in there, they'll be at war with Russia. Russia's prepared for that. The general staff in Moscow has already been instructed to look at another 800,000 troops that could be mobilized for the purpose of waging wider war if required. This is not something the Russians want. Moscow doesn't want it. Putin's been trying to end this thing almost from the moment it started. We won't admit that because we're losing. And once you are in a losing position, you're going to do everything in your power with control of the media and the government to try and persuade your populations that you're not losing.
Okay. Funny you mentioned that, because that's a perfect segue into, we have cut the music out of this because I don't want to get into any issues on YouTube here. But check out this video and we can talk over this one. Basically a commercial for NATO to talk about how strong we are with this new Nordic response 2024. I mean, this makes it look like it's awesome and cool stuff, and we're tough and we have bombers and all this. This is all a shell game. I mean, there's no substance underneath this, that we're actually combat ready for Russia, who now has 2 years of high-level combat.
In truth, the Norwegians were better prepared in 1940 for the Germans that attacked than they are today for what the Russians might do. And the German attack was feeble compared with what the Russians would launch. It's very tragic. And I see all these lovely girls in uniform pretending to be serious combat soldiers, and that, of course, is insane. The worst imaginable things would happen to those people on the battlefield. It's time for the people in Scandinavia, particularly in Norway, to wake up and smell the coffee. The way to avoid war with Russia is to come to terms with Russia right now in Eastern Europe and stop threatening Russia. All this does, this video, is persuade the Russians that they now have a greater threat in Norway than actually exists. The same thing is true in Finland and Sweden, where they're talking about putting NATO forces up near the Arctic Circle with missiles that could threaten Russia. This is sheer insanity. All this does is make matters worse and exacerbate the tensions. But, it looks great on television. People puff up their chests. They feel wonderful. They think of themselves as something they are not. We're not prepared for this. None of the Europeans are. We need to stop it.
We do. And if it was only this issue that we had to worry about, it would be a major concern, because obviously this could very easily escalate into tactical nuclear exchange, which is just unfathomable that anyone in the West, no matter what the circumstances domestically that they want to hold on to power, would actually risk a potential nuclear escalation, or somehow they've deluded themselves into believing that, well, the Russia wouldn't really do that because they know whatever they would think. But that's literally rolling the dice and just hoping, not an actual strategy, because Putin has made very clear that he is willing to do that if attacked by NATO. And if not, then there's no risk of it. But
well, Dan, if I might just say for a second, if we confront the Russians and it'll be on their terms if it's in Western Ukraine, or for that matter, in northern Norway. I mean, I can't imagine anything dumber than that. But if we do, we would face the unfortunate choice of either admitting defeat and conducting an ignominious withdrawal, which I think would be inevitable, or using nuclear weapons to compensate for our weakness on the ground. Remember, if you go back to 1969, the origins of flexible response were very clear. We didn't want to be in that position. We wanted to have enough conventional military power that we could deter the Russians. That meant making it clear to the Soviets at that point in time that if they attacked us, we had enough to resist them effectively and make the attack fail. That's very different from what we're doing now. We're threatening Russia with an attack, with a series of attacks. That's not how you make peace. That's how you create a war.
Right. And that's actually my number one driving imperative or concern, rather, is that we keep taking actions that don't deter the enemy, that don't make us safer, that don't work towards a negotiated settlement, but increase the chance of war. And unfortunately, it's not just there. Now, this next
one little point here
sure.
making. I was at the National Interest for a special dinner in 2019. And the dinner was populated with a number of neocons who were very anti-Russian in their outlook, free to express their hostilities to a Russian guest, by the way. And when this was over, I engaged one of them from the Atlantic Council in a discussion. And I said, don't you understand that if you press this issue in eastern Ukraine, you're going to end up with a war? And he looked at me and said, oh, that's ridiculous. There will be no war. That's not what we want. And there's not going to be a war. You don't understand. Russia won't do that. We have fundamentally misjudged and miscalculated Moscow from day one. It's time to stop. At some point, you have to listen to what the people in Moscow say and take it seriously. We aren't doing that. They've made it very clear. If we get involved in any way in Western Ukraine, we're going to end up at war with Russia. And that war could go to the global nuclear level unless we stay out. We don't want that. No sane human being would. No president of the United States in the last 80 years would even consider such a ridiculous notion.
Right. That is my concern, that I don't want that to be a past tense thing. Hasn't in 80 years. I would like to see it continuing on forward. But we spread now actually into the Middle East. Now, I don't want to go into the whole Israel-Hamas war and all that goes along with that. We could do a whole show on that. But this comment here by John Bolton over the weekend, I think it was, really, though, expresses kind of what the elite group in Washington, regardless of their political background, seem to be thinking. And certainly there's lots of advocates on both the right and the left for what Bolton says here.
This is not a Hamas war against Israel. This is not a Palestinian war against Israel. This is not an Arab war against Israel. This is an Iranian war against Israel through a number of surrogate terrorist organizations like Hamas, like the Houthis in Yemen, like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, like the Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria. All of these are part of the ring of fire strategy that Iran has been creating over the years. And to treat Gaza as the conflict is in itself a mistake. And the administration simply will not point the finger of responsibility at Tehran, which is the epicenter of all this.
So it's like a ring of fire, the whole area. We need to get into a war everywhere. Definitely keep all of our troops in Iraq and in Syria and everywhere else in the Middle East and expand. Clearly, he wants to go into Iran, where he's just been hanging for that for a long time. But there is nothing in America's national interest benefited by that to have anything to do with expanding the war to Iran. And I don't know, Doug, I think that no one learned a lesson from 2003 to where we went into a war against Iraq that was never necessary and basically handed Iraq over to Iran. So our position has been weakened because of that. And now he wants to somehow do it again. I can't even imagine the logic that would go behind that.
He's expressing a viewpoint that many of his colleagues, as you point out, inside the Beltway have shared for a long time. They have become very wealthy and prosperous as a result of advocating for war with Iran. Mr. Bolton became the national security advisor for President Reagan at the insistence of Sheldon Adelson. And Sheldon Adelson, of course, was a strident advocate for war with Iran. We had Senator McCain, who's Norman Podhoretz, who was his national security advisor, if you will, who talked about waking up every morning and praying every night that we would be at war with Iran. This is the same old trope. Nothing has changed. Iran, contrary to popular belief, is not behind everything. There are many, many forces operating in the region that have little or nothing to do with Iran. In fact, some of the most dangerous forces like ISIS were actually targeted against Iran and against Shiites inside Iraq and Syria. I think this is an old problem. It's not going to go away because these people are extremely well funded. Mr. Bolton is a millionaire, and he didn't make that money in business. These are people that have benefited from the lobby. The lobby wants war. The lobby controls the House, the Senate, and right now the White House. You heard President Biden repeat over and over and over again, whatever I do, I'm not going to, under any circumstances, cut off Israel from munitions and supply and support and money. Well, if you're not going to do that, nothing is going to change in Gaza, and that's what everybody tells him. He knows that. This is a simple fact of life. So what Bolton is telling us is nothing new, but it's not true. It's a lie. There are many, many other forces at play here. And our interest today is the same interest that we have always had in the region, which is stability and prosperity. To get stability and prosperity, you need some measure of peace. We're not supporting any efforts to create peace. We're supporting efforts to cultivate wider war, and we're going to get it. When Ramadan ends, I would say all bets are off after the 9th and 10th of April. We're going to see people coalesce into new organizations and actions will be taken. It takes time for people in any region to come together to do anything, particularly in the Muslim world, but miraculously, this is happening. And I think it's unfortunate because it doesn't need to. We could stop it.
Absolutely, 100%. But to your point there, in case anyone missed it, over the weekend, there was some, in fact, during the State of the Union, you may have heard President Biden was caught on a hot mic saying that he's going to have a come to Jesus meeting with Netanyahu. And over the weekend, he was asked, is there a red line? Because you've said that the Rafah operation is a red line. And he was asked, what do you mean by that? And here's his response.
The defense of Israel is still critical. So there's no red line. I'm going to cut off all weapons so they don't have the Iron Dome to protect them. They don't have. But there's red lines that if he crosses, he cannot have 30,000 more Palestinians dead as a consequence of going after. There's other ways to deal with the trauma caused by Hamas.
That was stunning even for Biden. To literally say there after saying there's a red line, then on national television, global observing, especially in Tel Aviv, to say, well, there really is no red line that I'm going to stop giving him. So basically, he just gave Netanyahu a huge green light to do whatever he wants.
Mr. Netanyahu has only really one option at this point, and that is escalation. He's brought Israel into a confrontation with the region. At the moment, they think in terms of exclusively the Arabs in Palestine and Gaza. They are considering possibilities with Hezbollah, but they will undoubtedly go into Lebanon and take on Hezbollah. But they think they've mastered the moment. They think they've mastered the moment because they see us as their essentially obedient servant. And the readiness of the United States Armed Forces, probably air and naval power only, but nevertheless, to step in and support whatever they want to do. As long as that unconditional support in Washington and London exists for Mr. Netanyahu, he will escalate. And after Ramadan ends, I don't know if they're going to wait that long to go into Rafah or not, but once that ends, the entire region is going to go through a tremendous transformation. And we will be on our path to a regional war that we cannot easily stop.
Right.
We still have the opportunity right now, if we were willing to do it, to call a halt to all of this and insist on something else. But obviously, that's not going to happen.
And that's exactly why the premise at the start of this show is that Biden is doing things all over the place that is pouring fuel onto potential for expanding war, not anything to dim it down. So we talked already about what happened what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine and the catastrophic consequence there and how we just keep rolling. Now here he's saying more fuel on the fire of wars here that's moving us in the opposite direction of peace. And even lately, we've had new additions here in North Korea. So during the Trump administration, during the time when you were there, Trump was trying to minimize that and to downgrade the threat and the tensions, and he reduced the amount of rehearsals, field exercises, all those kinds of things, joint maneuvers. But now then, according to this article here in today's Wall Street Journal, the stick in the equation is on display this month as the U.S. and South Korea conduct expanded annual springtime drills. This is the number of field exercises has doubled as participating troops, and an unprecedented 12 UN member states are involved, including these from France, Canada, and Philippines. Why? What is going on that would make us say, oh, the threat is growing when, I mean, North Korea had nuclear weapons during the Trump administration. That's not changed. Whether Kim Jong-un has said stuff, whatever. By ramping this stuff up, then Kim Jong-un, like Putin, and like some of these in the Middle East, they ramp their side up when you start ramping up your military exercises here. What is going on with this North Korea issue in the the Biden administration?
Well, remember when Trump went to Hanoi with an agreement, prepared to sign it with Mr. Kim, it was designed to denuclearize the peninsula. That agreement was sabotaged, subverted, and ultimately canceled with the help of Bolton and Pompeo, who were both certified neocons committed to confrontation and conflict. Unfortunately, President Trump, as was often the case in the past, backed away. He backed down. He shouldn't have. If we had pressed ahead with that agreement, which had strong support, by the way, from Beijing, because Beijing in particular doesn't like North Korea. The Chinese never have. They don't like it at all. They see it as a dangerous state that could easily drag them into a war they don't want to fight. And it happened to them once before in 1950.
Right.
The sponsor for North Korea historically is Moscow. It is Moscow that has come to North Korea's aid, provided them with equipment and technology. And once we made clear that we were going to drag out this Ukraine war, Moscow's solution was to provide North Korea with more and more dangerous technology and capability because they saw it as in their interest to counterbalance what we were doing in Europe. This is a spiraling problem that needs to stop. But what we are doing, predictably, is escalating. We are sending a message to North Korea that they are, in fact, in greater danger than ever, and we're prepared to do anything within our capabilities to attack them. We are also putting, by the way, advisors on small islands off the coast of China. I don't know if anybody's aware of it, but we have put some military advisors there in something that was called Quemoy and Matsu, two islands that are closer to the Chinese mainland than Taiwan. I don't know what we're doing in Taiwan, but obviously we want to send more money and weapons there. Everywhere along the Eurasian periphery, we are escalating because we have, for the last 50, 60 years, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, bullied, bombed, and sanctioned countries into agreement with us. Now, that did not work in Vietnam. I would argue it has not worked very well in the Middle East either. And this approach will fail miserably in Korea. I would not be surprised if this keeps up much longer if the South Koreans don't independently throw us off the peninsula, seeing us as a dangerous catalyst for war. If they were to do that, I think the Chinese would back them, and I think even the Japanese, who are very fearful of what might happen on the Eurasian continent, might well go along with it. But whether or not they do is probably irrelevant. The truth is, everything we do is counterintuitive.
Right.
Instead of walking in and saying, look, we don't want a war, we're saying we do. We would love to have a war. Please join us. People say, well, if you're taking this position of appeasement, well, I think this whole appeasement thing is misconstrued. If you're not ready to fight, if you don't have the wherewithal for it, if your society is in disarray, if your economic strength is at a low ebb, and you confront a very dangerous fiscal crisis based on your profligate spending and inability to manage your country financially, which is our problem, you're in no position to take anybody on. So you don't want a war. If you go to war, you want to go to war when you're prepared, when you have a damn good shot at winning it. We don't. Anywhere we fight right now, we do not.
Now,
but there's a belief that we do.
That's something I want to touch on here. I mentioned that at the top, that there was an unknown or a not commonly understood danger to our national security that all of these things are starting to cause. And you've mentioned several times in the course of this show here that we're not ready to fight. You said that in that Tucker Carlson interview too. You said we're not ready for that. And here in the news just today is the latest evidence of exactly why that is. It's called Broken Track: Suicides and Suffering in Army's Exhausted Army Community. And what they're talking about here is that the operational tempo is just crushing our force, because we're all over the place in of course, Europe in large numbers. We're in Africa. We're in the Middle East. We're increasing up tempo in Asia. There's no backing up from any of this, and it is crushing our people. The Armor Force needs to train hard to be ready, the general said, who's in charge of this, or I'm sorry, a retired general. But it cannot sustain that tempo indefinitely. And so that's every 18 months, they can be gone for 9 months. And that's what's crushing them, which is causing a soaring suicide rate, as it's talking here. Now, further in this article, there was even more practical issues talking about the maintenance capacity. And they even had what they called maintenance queens of armored vehicles, where they don't have enough spare parts and maintenance people to fix stuff. So they just keep this one section of vehicles over here that's just used to rate for spare parts to keep the rest of them operational as much as they can. And those things can't be sustained. And Doug, nobody knows this better than you do, because you were an armored cav squadron commander. You of course led us in an armored battle, big armored battle in Desert Storm. So can you kind of give us a hint as to how serious this issue actually is?
We've needed, certainly since the mid to late 1990s, a regular army of about 600,000 in order to sustain the operations around the world that we've been committed to. There's an unwillingness to admit that. And there has been a temptation repeatedly to take money and equipment and promises of modernization and silver bullet technology as a compensation for increasingly reduced manpower. In other words, we'll give you this fancy helicopter, this new fighting system, whatever it is, in return for which, we'll cut another 30,000, another 20,000, another 50,000. The force is rotten to the core. It's not just a consequence of the wrong structure for the wrong century, which it is. We have no depth of at all in terms of fighting power, no depth in terms of logistics and sustainment. So if you were to try and go to the Middle East or Eastern Europe and fight, you'd probably be out of business in 60 days at the most. If you got past 30, I'd be surprised. We don't have that fundamental strength that we had back in 1990 and 91. Now, I'm not advocating for a draft or anything like that. I think we could maintain a better army and a larger one that makes sense. But we're sapping resources from the Army to pay for other things. And what is even worse, we're discouraging competent, talented people from joining.
Right. That's exactly what I was going to mention next, because there's an issue with recruiting, which is directly related to this, because people see this kind of stuff. Maybe the big talking heads up there can talk about all these grandiose crap like Bolton did a second ago, but regular people, the people that we need to come into the armed forces, they see it for what it is, and they're saying, hell no, I'm not going to be part of that.
Well, that's true, but you're also bleeding talent. People that might otherwise stay and serve for many years are leaving as soon as they can get out. I have some relatives that are right now serving in the Army. One nephew, I have another nephew in the United States Navy, and all of them tell me the same thing. Everyone wants to leave these armed forces as soon as they can get out. And now in the Army, they're being told you may not be able to leave, even though your commitment, whatever it turned out to be, 4 years, 5 years, is up, because we have no one with which to replace you. So we will involuntarily extend you. Well, this sort of thing doesn't work very well either. We have had a force overstretched, overstrained in the extreme now for many, many years. You know that from when you were still on active duty in the Balkans, in Southwest Asia, in the Middle East. This is not just a a serious morale problem. It's a morale killer. And people that can do other things, that want to do other things, will get out. Look, the entire force structure is a disaster. It all needs to be overhauled. The overhead is frightening. And there's no one in the senior ranks that seems to give a damn. That's what's really, really depressing to me. One of the things I learned as I rose in the Army and was exposed to more and more senior officers is that they look at the enlisted men as sort of fungible parts. So 10 leave, we'll find 10 more next week. No, you won't. And how good these people are, the human capital counts. Human capital is huge. Everything.
Everything, yes.
It's everything. It's everything in the private sector. It's everything in the military. None of it is working. So to go back to the original problem, here we have blowhards are us at the top of the United States government and NATO, making promises we cannot keep. And it's dangerous because the Russians are not bluffing. What they have is real. What they can do is real. They have confidence. They have social cohesion. They have good, solid forces. Finally, I was glad to see the Chief of Staff of the Army at least admit that publicly. He's the only one who has. We don't want to get into a fight with these people. And the good news is they don't want to get into a fight with us. So everything we are doing right now is calculated to destroy us, to put us in a position that is untenable, from which we cannot recover. And that brings us back to the great fear. What do you do if you're failing miserably and in full retreat and face destruction? Well, you turn to a nuclear weapon.
Right.
And that's the last thing we want to do. We don't ever want to be in that position. That's why we develop flexible response. What we've got now is rigid, inflexible stupidity response.
Right.
That's got to stop. The American people don't want this. They're not being asked, but they know they don't want it. What they want is a secure border, an end to illegal immigration, an end to the criminality at home, and they want to get rid of these people that have been marched by the millions into their country that they cannot employ, let alone ever assimilate.
And so I think I know the answer to this question here, but what if any of these fires that we're throwing gasoline on right now erupts and blows up, and our troops are actually called in to fight an actual war against a competent enemy, wherever it may happen to be? What do you think would happen in like, say, the first 6 months of any kind of conflict like that with the force we have right now?
Well, I wrote a book called Margin of Victory, and the first chapter was about the British Expeditionary Force in 1914 and what happened to it. And the British Expeditionary Force of 1914 was, by British standards, a very good army, but it was very small. And
I got it right here.
Well, it was inadequately prepared. It went out and it did the best it possibly could. And by a miracle, France was saved from being overrun. But that force was sacrificed. We don't want to sacrifice 150 or 200,000 men. We don't want to do that. And unlike 1914, when the British had a French ally that put millions of soldiers into the field, we don't have an ally like that. We have no allies with any substantial military capability. That's the problem. The once great German army and air force no longer exists. They were the ones that we would have depended upon acutely in any crisis or conflict, as you know. That's gone. You can't build it up overnight. So the smart thing to do right now is to end this fighting, to cut the best possible deal that we can get for the Ukrainian nation, and to try and help the Ukrainians recover, which is very much open to question right now. Instead, the vulture capitalists want to go in and strip it and exploit it and use it for their own purposes. And no one in Europe is standing up against them. And no one in Washington seems to care. And why would they? Because they're also beneficiaries of the vulture capitalists' largesse.
They are. And that's 100% in agreement, 100% in agreement with that's what we should do. And obviously with our current leadership and the crazies you just mentioned, that seems pretty low that that's going to actually happen. Before I let you go, Doug, I do want to mention one other thing. You actually brought up the issue of the border or so. And I don't know if you caught this over the weekend, but during there was a bit of a clash during the State of the Union between Lincoln Riley and Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's been covered a lot here. But over the weekend, President Biden discussed that and had a really strange thing to say about the assailant that actually killed her.
Lincoln Riley, an innocent young woman who was killed by an illegal. That's right. But how many of the thousands of people being killed by illegals? To her parents, I say, my heart goes out to you, having lost children myself. An undocumented person. And I shouldn't have used illegal. It's undocumented. And I'm not going to treat any of these people with disrespect. Look, they built the country.
I just have to scratch my head when you don't want to insult the person who murdered a young woman in America. I don't get that.
Well, we live in an upside down world. And the upside down world is one in which the criminals that commit crimes against American citizens are really misguided, slightly deranged, but okay, and should be released back into the population. And illegal immigrants or migrants, they're really okay. After all, they built the nation, which you and I both know is absurd nonsense. This is all too reminiscent of the Spanish Civil War. We haven't talked about that in the past, but that should be a conversation we have in the future. Because in the run-up to the Spanish Civil War, the so-called Republican left were communists, and they began talking about Sovietizing Spain, and they attacked everything that was Spanish. We're living in an environment right now where our government is attacking everything that is American. As I've said before, this government and its policies are effectively anti-American by design. It's frightening. And this is just another manifestation of that upside-down world that the people in Washington have been constructing.
Well, Doug, like I said at the outset, the one piece of hope that we have is one of the groups that you're now starting to lead, which is Our Country, Our Choice, instead of the choice that's being made for us in Washington. And if it was just up to that, I would be pretty pessimistic about things. But I wish you continued success and more people to go join. If you're watching us and you haven't already, go to ourcountryourchoice.com. I think it is, right? Isn't that the address? Yeah.
Ourcountryourchoice.com. Yep.
And join that growing team. Because with numbers, we can actually influence the government in ways that they don't like and ways that would be good for us.
And keep in mind, we partner with other organizations that are like-minded. So they should not see us necessarily as a competitor, but they should see us as a collaborator because we all face the same problem. We're trying to solve it peacefully. We'd like to solve it at the ballot box. But it's getting to the point now where many people are losing hope that that's possible. We haven't lost hope yet. We still believe in it, and we hope that others will join us. So
exactly, because if the day it gets to that point to where it gets crossed and people generally on both the left and the right don't think that that's the only way to fix it, then you have some real serious problems that are going to be incredibly difficult and bloody to fix. And God help us if we ever get there.
That's right.
Thank you very much for coming on, Doug. We wish you continued success on that. And we thank all of you guys for coming in here today.